So for right now, for now on, we are recording this training. But Costin Jordache is not only a vice president in this public relation and marketing for Adventist HealthCare. For last 20 years, he worked very, very well for communication. He served in role including news editor for Adventist Review and Adventist World Magazine. He was a vice president of communication in the Central California Conference of Seventh Adventists. He was director of communication in Texas Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, senior pastor of the Dallas First Seventh-day Adventist Church, pastor for media at the Loma Linda University Church, and adjunct instructor in communication at Southwestern Adventist University. Costin holds a master's degree in radio, television, and films, as well as an MBA, along with a BA in theology and biblical languages. Wow. He specializes in strategic media and communication leadership, public relations, teaching and organizational leadership. And Costin also serves as a board member for Your Best Pathway to Health, a humanitarian service of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And the best role of Costin is married, is an husband, married with Leah Jordache, a pastor who teaches high school Bible courses in Spencerville Adventist Academy. They have two amazing boys, Roman and Lance. Wow. Costin, we are amazed. You are really in the middle of the communication setting, so you know what to say. So we are here from, let's say, good part of Europe in our division, Inter-European division. Some of them will receive a translation, some only the Italian will receive a translation. So I invite the Italians to go to the interpretation and click Spanish. We didn't found the Italian word, but we found the Spanish, but this will be not Spanish, will be Italian. So for the Italian, there will be a translation. For the others, the privilege to listen Costin speaking in English. Costin, your home country is America, or you have another country?
Corrado, I was born in the country of Romania, in Bucharest, and I left when I was 4 years old. So I still enjoy good Romanian cuisine, cooking. I still speak a bit of the language. My mother never let me forget it. And I still have many, many wonderful friends, not only in Romania, but throughout Europe. And I'm so glad to see many of your faces, some of which I recognize and some of which I hope to get to know better over the next few years.
Fantastico. Costin, I don't want to take other time. This is your time. Thank you very much to have accepted at the last minute to lead this training. Thank you very much, Costin. It's your time.
Thank you, Corrado. Thank you so much. Thank you, Paolo, as well, and Andreas for hosting this wonderful time together. We're going to be talking about something that is extremely crucial for this moment in time for our beloved Seventh-day Adventist Church, and that is, how do we better understand journalism? How do we understand its role within society in general? And more specifically within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And how do we understand the trends in journalism that can better inform how we as Seventh-day Adventist communication professionals can engage in journalism better, right? So I think that this is such an important topic that it requires, I believe, the leading of the Holy Spirit. So with your permission, I will pray for us so that we can better understand the heart and mind of God as we talk today. Lord, we thank you so much for this opportunity that we have as communication professionals from literally at this point around the world, and specifically from the many countries of Europe. We pray right now, Lord, that you would give us wisdom as we look at many, many different concepts related to this very crucial role of journalism within our society and within our church. Help us to understand better. Help us to know your will for our denomination, for our church around the world, and help us to better understand this subject by the time our meeting ends today. That is our prayer, and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, everyone. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to try to share my screen, and unfortunately, that I know of, and maybe Paulo or Corrado or Andreas know how to do this, but I would like to share my screen, and hopefully you'll see me at the same time as well. Zoom doesn't have a very simple way to do that where you can split the screen. But there are some things that I'd like you to see with your eyes, and maybe it'll help us remember things better. So I'm going to share my screen. There may be times when I'll come off of sharing and we'll do a little bit more of talking back and forth, but we'll see how this works. And again, those of you who are hosting the meeting and have maybe a better technical understanding of what's available on Zoom, please let me know what I can do from my end, and we'll hopefully make this a good experience for everyone. Okay. Here is the other thing that I would like to encourage, and that is, and I'm hoping my Zoom functionality will work well, but if you'd like to ask questions, place them in the chat, and if I can get to them during the presentation, I will do so. But if not, then we'll come back at the end and we'll begin to answer some of those questions. Just to test this out, can someone send me just a quick message in the chat, just so that I can see whether on my end it's going to work. Right. Okay. So what I'm getting is that I have to update my Zoom app, which we are not going to do at the moment. And what that means is I'm going to bring it up on my cell phone. So if you would just give me one moment, I'm going to join with my cell phone. And whoever is a host, if you can kindly let my cell phone in. Give me just one moment.
Costin, may I interrupt just for a moment and ask if the people put questions to you? It would be nice if we all could see them. So if the hosts in the chat would make it available that everybody could see it, and so that we can put messages in for all. It is just confined to the three hosts, which is not so so helpful. So if other people, they pose the questions and they have the same questions in their mind, they don't need to post them again. So if we can see them all and share, so that could be shared. So I would ask the host to open up that. It's done now. Thank you, Paulo. Great.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you. That works for me as well. And while Stefan bought me some time with his question, I was able to bring up the chat on my cell phone, and that is in front of me here. So now it works just fine, and we can get into our presentation. Okay, so on that note, a good place to begin when studying any subject is clearly understanding what is the definition of that particular topic, or in this case, of that particular word. So what I'd like to do is, again, to share my screen and share with you, there we go, and share with you the definition. Now, let me just ask a quick question. Are you still able to see my video, some of you, or are you only able to see my screen in full screen?
We see both, Costin.
Wonderful. Thank you for that confirmation. That's exactly what the intended purpose is. Okay, so let's move then into the understanding of what journalism is. Number one, journalism, by definition, is the activity of gathering, assessing, creating, and presenting news and information, right? That is, again, the role of journalism. That is the definition of journalism. Here is a better way for us to break down a little bit more the role of journalism, which is critical to our understanding of journalism and to the role of journalism specifically within an organization, including ours, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So Number one, the role of journalism begins by keeping the public informed. So to keep the public informed is perhaps the primary and the number one role of journalism. Then it is to gather news and information. Third, it is to assess and analyze the information. In other words, to make sense of it. Fourth, it is to communicate the information in a truly fair and balanced way. And then finally, to make available various perspectives and opinions on that news and information. Ago, when I began my career in professional communication, I remember one of my professors saying to a large class, he said, remember, all news sources are biased. Every single news source that you're familiar with has a bias of some kind. Now, that to me was disturbing to a degree, because in the United States, we grew up with the idea that journalists were truth tellers. We grew up with the idea that you can trust a piece of news that came from a very respected news organization like the New York Times or the Washington Post or National Public Radio, and we were brought up to believe that you could trust what you heard or what you read or what you took in. Ultimately, over these many years, I have come to realize that truly this is very much the case, that all news sources, to one degree or another, are biased. And this is why this is the reality. The reality is that news sources are biased because news sources are run by people. And people are always biased. You and I have a set of biases, whether we want to admit it or not, that we bring into any context, into any professional environment. We come with these.
Diciamo, osservano la realtà.
The owner of a news outlet, or the president of a news outlet, or the news director for a particular news outlet. Those biases, sometimes they're even unconscious biases. Those biases can begin to inform the way that the news comes out of that organization. So here is the goal for us. The goal for us is to be as objective as possible when developing a story. The goal is to be as objective as possible, knowing and understanding that no matter how pure our hearts are, that we always have biases that we bring into any particular story or any particular news organization. Now, the next part, what is public relations then, and how is it related to journalism? That is a very, very important. That is a very, very important question. So here's what I'd like to offer. First, a definition of public relations that will help us understand the difference between public relations and journalism. Public relations is a strategic communication process that builds mutually beneficial relationships between organizations and their publics. Again, public relations is a strategic communication process that builds mutually beneficial relationships between organizations and their publics. Public relations, in essence, seeks to build positive relationship with various audiences or with various communities or with constituencies, as we say in the church, right? Which generates mostly positive news and positive stories, and it uses what we could call triumphalist language, right? In other words, the news coming from a public relations office, more often than not, is always good news, unless you're talking about crisis management, right? So that's something that we again need to understand. Public relations tends to be more that part, ladies and gentlemen, I will probably repeat. Journalism is not concerned with making a good impression on behalf of the organization. Journalism is concerned with communicating accurate facts and assisting audiences in making sense of them. That's the primary role of journalism, not making a good impression on behalf of the organization. Journalism, and now here's a relationship, journalism does depend on public relations for official press releases, for official statements, and includes those statements, includes the information coming out of those press releases in the coverage of the issue. So there is a distinct difference between journalism and public relations. And part of our time together is going to be to break those two apart, because there are some challenges currently in those two worlds kind of coexisting on top of each other. And we have to understand how to separate them, how to understand the value of each discipline, and then how to make them coexist within our work within the Seventh-day Adventist Church in a positive way. I'd like to give you an example maybe of an article, maybe should I say maybe just a sentence of an article written from a public relations perspective versus a journalism perspective. So again, forgive me, those of you who are deeply aware of the journalistic standard may find this repetitive, but others of you may not be very familiar. And so again, we will kind of assume that all of us are starting from the ground up and learning together about the discipline of journalism. Let's look at these two sentences. Same sentence. From a public relations approach, here's how this sentence would sound. The powerful evangelist inspired everybody in the room, which was filled with so many people that there was standing room only, clearly a sign of the working of the Holy Spirit, right? I can tell you that many of the stories that we were looking to publish for Adventist Review during my time there sounded very much like this first sentence, written more from a public relations perspective. Now, take a look at the second sentence, written from more of an Associated Press style, journalistic standard style format. And this is what it would sound like. The same sentence would sound like this. In a room which was filled to standing room only, the evangelist inspired all those who attended, pay careful attention, said event organizers. Quote, this was definitely the work of the Holy Spirit, end quote, said Pablo Rodriguez, pastor of the local Seventh-day Adventist Church. You see the difference. The difference is in the first one, the voice of the author puts in a number of what we call value judgments. And value judgments are where we ascribe certain feelings, we ascribe certain expressions to, or qualities to a particular moment, to a particular event. In journalism, the author, if you're writing traditional news pieces, the author is not allowed to inject their own voice into the matter. You can quote others who inject their voice, such as the local church pastor, such as event organizers. That is very appropriate, but you are quoting someone else who is putting in those value judgments or those particular characteristics or qualities about this particular event. So notice that journalism sticks to the facts and attributes those value judgments, that emotion, right, to the people who could be quoted or referenced. The voice of the journalist does not inject personal opinion into a standard news article. So let's continue to look at maybe a couple of other differences between public relations and journalism, staying with this same scenario of this event that's taking place in this local community. So if you look on this grid, on the left-hand side, public relations, on the right side, journalism, let's take a look at what public relations would do. Public relations in general, because we're trying to put on the best face of the organization possible, would not mention that several businesses in the community were quite upset at the number of cars that were parked in the neighborhood every night. We would sort of leave that out of the article because that would not reflect well on the organization. Journalism, on the other hand, would take a very different approach. journalism would quote a member of the community expressing his concern about the parking of the cars, but would also quote a church leader who would express sympathy with the community members, and that the church was discussing these concerns with community leaders to try to figure out some kind of solution. So journalism would take a much more transparent approach in terms of all of the dynamics surrounding the event. Let's look at, again, public relations. Public relations would not necessarily mention that on average, 40% of those baptized in a public evangelistic setting would leave church fellowship eventually, and only focus on how many were baptized. Normally, that's what we see. But journalism, if we took a journalistic approach, would mention the statistic along with a quote from a church leader admitting that the local church would have to work very hard to integrate new members into the community and into the active life of the church. Again, it's more of an analysis of the moment and an acknowledgement that not everything is positive about this particular moment. There may be some negative aspects to the moment, but again, a good journalist and one who is an ethical journalist would quote various individuals who would have something to offer of value to even a negative aspect of a particular moment, right? Very critical for us to begin to understand in our own community of faith and how we can begin to do this more and more and more around the world in a very respectful sort of way and environment. All right, on that note, let's go ahead now and transition quickly to the types of journalism or news-related writing that we can use. Now, there are more than these, but these are some of the main ones. And if you take a look there at the grid, let's begin with the top left, news reporting. We've been talking mostly in our time together now about news reporting. It's a standard report regarding the facts associated with an event or a topic, and it's focusing mostly on what and where and when questions, right? This is the standard news approach. We call it the Associated Press style that is basically geared toward informing the public about something that is happening and who is involved and what's happening and what the purpose was of something or the other. Now, the second type is what we could call investigative reporting. In this case, we have essentially an in-depth article that is seeking to uncover important aspects of a complex issue. It also addresses the why aspect of an issue. Very, very important. So that now we're not just talking about what happened, where it happened, who was involved, but why did it happen? What were some of the very underlying elements or background reasons for why this thing had to happen? Investigative reporting. The next one is called feature reporting. Feature reporting is an in-depth exploration of one topic, right? And these are stories in print that are much longer. These are stories that get turned into 1-hour documentaries from a television perspective. This is feature reporting in which you want to get deep into a particular story. The next one is a review or commentary. So this is essentially an opinion article about a particular topic based on the experience of the journalist. Very critical to understand, as you all know already, reviews and commentaries are not news in and of themselves. They are commentary on the news, and the important part is to have many different voices who provide various perspectives to one very important event, right? News, reviews, and commentaries. The next one, these are columns. A column is a regular contribution by a journalist who shares an opinion about a certain topic of expertise or an area that they're familiar with. And then finally, the op-ed. This is called the opposite of the editorial page, traditionally in newspaper settings. These are opinion articles written by members of the community, not necessarily journalists, but members of the community who then submit their opinion piece, and then either the newspaper or the television outlet decides to run with this opinion by a community member or not. So those are the types of journalism that are at our disposal that we can use and should use, a good mix of all of them as we develop news outlets, Adventist news outlets around the world. So now we transition to the trends in journalism that we are seeing around the world that, again, can inform our work as communication professionals. We move quickly into what we called the rise of democratized journalism, the rise of democratized journalism. There are several other words and phrases that describe this type of journalism. You see them there at the bottom of that screen: citizen journalism or participatory journalism. Ultimately, when you couple the rise of smartphones and the availability of smartphones around the world, when you couple that with global internet access, and then on top of that, you add social platforms, social media platforms, essentially, we have turned everyone around the world into a potential journalist, right? Potential journalist. Now, here's what we're going to do with all of these trends. We're going to look at both advantages and disadvantages. I personally am an enormous advocate of always looking at both advantages and disadvantages of anything in life. One of my business professors once told me, he said, listen, to everything in life, there are trade-offs. Trade-offs means that there are advantages and disadvantages. And this is very much true of all of these trends within journalism. So let's take a look at some of the advantages of democratized journalism, participatory journalism. Number one, we have more ears and eyes. Oops, we're gonna skip that for just a moment. There's a quote that I want to share with you, but that comes just a little bit later. We have more eyes and ears in the field with the ability to quickly tip off news organizations when breaking news stories develop, right? So we have more eyes and ears, which is a positive thing. We have the availability of grassroots perspectives and opinions to be shared about a topic or event. We have more voices that can surprise us with intelligent information that before we were not able to have access to. And number three, we have the possibility for better and deeper engagement between news organizations and their audiences, right? We have the possibility for more interchange, more dialogue between readers and viewers and news outlets. Here's the quote that I wanted to share with you, and that is essentially, up until this point, the social in social media has simply meant the platforms in which we work. In the future, social will mean the audiences we interact with, right? This is Mandy Velez, a social media editor at the Daily Beast, a news outlet very well known, at least in the United States. So the idea that we begin to interact more with our audiences rather than news being a one-lane highway, it now becomes a dialogue. It now becomes a two-lane highway in which we're able to interact better. Here's another quote that I thought you might benefit from. This one from another news outlet, Vox. Lauren Katz, Senior Engagement Manager there, comments on articles, crowdsourced reporting, and Facebook groups aren't new ideas in journalism. What's different now is an understanding of why paying attention to community spaces is crucial to the health of the journalism industry, cultivating trust and loyalty. When it comes to their values, newsrooms will make the people who consume their content a priority in order to reach those goals. So news outlets who are pursuing, you see that, trust and loyalty will begin engaging with readers in a way that moves beyond, we have all the information and we're feeding it to you, to, yes, we have part of the information, and we hope very much that you will begin to engage with us to fill in from your perspective what you may know about a particular topic. So yes, the democratized journalism movement does have some advantages. Now let's move to some disadvantages of democratized journalism, and that is, number one, the blurred lines, so lines that are not clear anymore. the blurred lines in the digital space between facts, agenda, propaganda, and marketing. This is very much due to the fact that everyone now is a perceived journalist. But what's difficult to parse out, to differentiate between is fact, agenda, propaganda, and or marketing, right? Very difficult when you have so many voices around the world, all sort of pretending to be professional journalists. I struggle with something that I hear all the time, and that is people who say, well, I get my news from Facebook, or I get my news from WhatsApp. Clearly, both Facebook and WhatsApp in this case are platforms on which news can exist and should exist, correct? The challenge is when we decide that only one of those platforms will be our source of news, because ultimately all of those platforms operate along a series of algorithms, and ultimately they will continue to feed you what it thinks you're interested in, and will continue to feed ultimately your biases, our biases, as we standardize on, let's just say, Facebook. I get my news from Facebook. Facebook will continue to feed you only the news that it thinks that you want to hear. There's a great debate right now, some of you may be aware of it, regarding these platforms. Are they platforms? Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and WhatsApp. Are they platforms or are they publishers? Because if they are publishers, it means that they are essentially curating information and feeding it to you, which makes them a publisher. Much like the BBC, much like they are publishers curating a certain set of news and then sending it your way. If they are platforms, then they are agnostic to any of that and will allow you to have access to anything and everything that you want to have access to. But there's a debate about which one of those these particular organizations are. My position, just so that at least you know the way that I feel about it, is that they are not publishers, or should I say their original intent was not to be publishers, right? And so the critical question as we look at a piece of news that we find on one of these social media platforms is, what is the original source of the news that made that available to me, right? Who originally published this particular story, or who produced this particular piece of video news? That is the crucial question that all of us have to ask, rather than do you get your news from Facebook or WhatsApp or Twitter, which essentially should only be platforms on which all sorts of news is available. Now, then another disadvantage of democratized journalism, that's what we're still talking about, another disadvantage is the rise of fake news. Of course, everyone has heard and knows clearly about fake news, because ultimately in the world of democratized journalism, anyone can report news. Anyone can become a purveyor or a curator of information and news and send that out there and become or claim to be what's called a source of truth. That's part of the problem with the rise of democratized journalism. Again, advantages and disadvantages. I'll leave you with one more quote here about this, and that is, the digital world has muddied formerly clear divisions between factual news, sales pitches, hoaxes, and hyper-partisan propaganda designed to incite. So this is, again, Sally Lehrman from The Atlantic, another reputable news source in the United States, and the director of the Trust Project. We'll hear about the Trust Project in just a little bit of time. So that concludes our first trend in journalism, the rise of democratized journalism. We move now to another trend, and that is transparency in journalism. Transparency in journalism. So the central question in this space is, what is the source of this content and what is the source's agenda, right? What is the source's agenda. So in response to democratized journalism, readers and viewers are requiring greater transparency from news organizations. They want to know what's behind the story, who is writing the story, what is their worldview, what is their agenda. And one specific response that I just mentioned is this thing called the Trust Project, right? The Trust Project. The Trust Project is a project that seeks to help differentiate between real and fake news. And it is a consortium. It is a voluntary participation project. And currently, over 200 international news organizations have signed up as partners. I'll put this screen up. You may recognize some of these news organizations. This is just a few out of the over 200 news organizations around the world that have signed up to be voluntary participants in this Trust Project. Now, on top of that, both Google and Facebook have agreed to use what they call trust indicator icons that have come out of the work of the Trust Project, trust indicator icons with news-related content, so that they can help the reader better understand the source behind the news. So you can look this up on your own time. Trust indicator icons, Google, Facebook. It is a very positive trend that we definitely want to take notes from. A couple of quotes that might be helpful to all of us. This one comes from the Trust Project itself. It turns out, organizers of the Trust Project say, it turns out that readers don't just want to weed out imposters. They don't want to just identify who the kind of the fake news purveyors are. They want to know who wrote or produced a story, what expertise they have, and whether the publisher has an agenda. Transparency matters. Again, a quote from the Trust Project. Here's another quote. This one is from Richard Gringas, a vice president for news, current vice president for news at Google. And he says, the Trust Project's required disclosures and clear definitions should help the public and Google systems recognize the value, quality, to recognize and value quality journalism, right? Very, very, very good news from Google, at least on paper, right? It's good to continue being a little bit cautious and skeptical, but at least Google has decided that they want to adopt trust indicators. And this is their vice president for news indicating that he believes that we will continue to recognize and value quality journalism because of this. Now, a second consideration when it comes to transparency in journalism, and that is the millennial generation. Before we get to that quote, I'll tell you just a little bit about the millennial generation that I'm sure many of you already know all about, but it's good for us to refresh our memory. The millennial generation, those born within that generation, were born between 1981 and the mid-90s. There's some debate, 94, 95, 96, somewhere around there, which essentially means that there are around 2 billion millennials around the world, 2 billion. And here is the most important thing to remember about this millennial generation in the context of journalism. Transparency is among the highest rated value of millennials, transparency. It is potentially the top core value in general, clearly in general, among the millennial generation. They have, again, in general, institutional skepticism. They don't trust organizations or institutions just by default, when in the past, you know, the generations that came before the millennial generations were very, very duty bound. They were, if my organization, if my church says it, then I believe it, right? Not so with the millennial generations and those that came after the millennial generations. So they don't trust to begin with, which means that institutions have to work harder to gain and maintain the trust of over 2 billion millennials. And here are a couple of quotes that I'll share with you. This one from Forbes magazine, very reputable, a source of business news here in the United States. Forbes magazine writes, brands, now we talk about it in the context of brands, but equate brands with organizations, because a brand is just basically the reputational promise of an organization. So that's what we're talking about here. Brands must share far more detailed information than ever before. This unprecedented level of transparency must go beyond advertising and mandatory disclosures for brands to succeed with the coveted millennial demographic. When a brand offers complete transparency, 94%, and they conducted surveys, 94% of survey respondents are likely to be loyal to that brand. And when consumers switch to a brand in favor of increased transparency, they're likely to stay for the long haul, in other words, for a long time. In fact, 56% say that they would be very likely to stay loyal to a completely transparent brand for life. It is clear that trust is the new currency of brand loyalty, right? So again, I'd like to share with you another quote, this one from the Media Insight Project. And this was, again, a study done on millennials and news by the American Press Institute and the Associated Press. And here is what those leaders and organizers of this study said. And when millennials do dig deeper, the most important qualities that make a destination useful are that they know the source well, 57%, and that this digital source is transparent and rich with references and links. So you can begin to see that this transparency in journalism is a significant trend that affects organizations both positively and negatively. Again, what are some of the advantages? Some of the advantages of transparency is clearly that we are able to have a much more in-depth understanding of those organizations or those communities, those countries to which we give our loyalty, our time, our energy, our own life we give to these organizations. And it just is ethical for those organizations, those communities, those countries to be able to represent well and transparently to their citizens, to their community members, to their members, if we're talking about a church, about what's really happening behind the scenes. And that clearly has to be done very respectfully and appropriately. But transparency, the advantage of this trend in journalism is that it allows readers to be much more informed about those organizations that they give a lot to of their own life. One of the disadvantages of this trend is that it puts a real sort of pressure on public relations and public relations professionals to be able to communicate transparently more than they were ever asked to do before. Before, you can simply say something, most people would believe it, and there would be a few people that would doubt what you said. Today, with this rise in transparency within journalism, more and more readers are demanding, requiring more in-depth information. And from an organizational perspective, that sometimes isn't easy to do. Those of you who have worked in professional leadership roles understand that it is not an easy thing to do to begin to understand how you can be appropriately transparent. We'll talk about that just a little bit more later, while still understanding that some things are private, some things are protected by law to stay private and confidential. So it isn't an easy thing to be an organizational leader in an era in which transparency is demanded and required by many, many readers and viewers around the world. Now, let's move to the next trend, and that is called iterative journalism. Iterative journalism. That word iterative means that it happens in stages or in phases, right? Iterative. There are different iterations at all of these levels that allow something to develop. In this case, we're talking about journalism. So iterative journalism is the practice of posting a short breaking news story before all the facts are known and updating it as the story develops. Many of you are very familiar with this practice in journalism. Something happens, there is, let's say, a mass shooting in a public square of some sort. Immediately there's a story, but it's only one sentence long, 2 sentences long. This is what we know. This is a developing story. Please come back for more information. So it creates many different iterations or updated versions of the same story. And the story developments come from journalists working on the story and from readers posting comments and offering additional information. So again, this is a very positive development when it comes to democratized journalism, because let's say you have 3 or 4 people in that public square. They're not able to post video of what happened in real time. They're able to tweet their experience, right? And so then the journalist who is working on that story has now multiple eyes and ears that he or she can choose from when developing the story, or should I say that maybe the next iteration of the story. Now, you should know that this is actually a highly controversial subject in journalism. Just because it's something that we all do doesn't mean that it doesn't come without some debate or some controversy. There are both, again, advantages and disadvantages. The advantages is that it allows a breaking news story to be released early, prompting other news outlets to uncover further details. So now it's not just the people in the public square, but it's also other news outlets. So let's say in the United States, the New York Times breaks a story, but then all of the other news outlets begin working on the same story, and some journalist uncovers part of the story that one doesn't. So they all begin working together to uncover details of the story. Number 2, a second advantage is that it engages audiences in what we could call crowdsourcing in a way to uncovering further details. We talked about that already. And it uses psychology to frame a story in the most interesting and compelling way to the audience. So breaking news, more updates to come. This is what we know. So again, news organizations, remember, they have to have viewers, they have to have readers in order to survive, many of them because they have advertisers who require that they have a certain number of eyeballs on stories. So there's a certain psychology that works well with iterative journalism. Let me share with you a quote from Francesco Marconi. Did I say that appropriately? This is the head of research and development at the Wall Street Journal, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. And Francesco says, this is human-centered reporting, right? Human-centered reporting. Iterative journalism begins with people, but it looks beyond just demographic data to understand how individuals feel and what they need when seeking news. Iterative journalism is empathetic journalism. It uses audience interviews, surveys, analysis of comments, and observation to learn what readers care about, not just how many of them there are. So again, all of these interactions become part of the story as the story develops, iteration after iteration after iteration. Now, there are some disadvantages. Some of the disadvantages to iterative journalism are many times the details that are being updated are not necessarily factual. In other words, because the breaking story was released fast, some of the facts were most likely wrong. I have worked with dozens of reporters in my time in professional communication, and I can tell you that many of them, and some of you will very much relate to this, are working on a deadline. In other words, something happens, they only have 1 hour to come up with something, in some cases, only minutes to be able to post something quickly. Well, something happens when we work quickly, and many times what we compromise is quality. And so this is not necessarily something that is done intentionally, but is really a reality when we talk about human nature and human frailty when it comes to working quickly to do something that is supposed to take a longer amount of time so that you can focus more on the quality. So that's just one of the downsides, one of the disadvantages. A second disadvantage is that many argue that very few people go back to see the updates of the story. So thus the initial post is what remains in the reader's minds as reality. So let's just take an attack that potentially was a terrorist attack. So the journalist writes that in the first iteration of the story and says that this is being investigated, or leaders believe that this was a terrorist attack. the concept here is that many people will read that and then will never come back an hour later to see what the update on the story was. And suddenly now we're going to social media and posting, I can't believe we've had another terrorist attack in our community, in our town, when the journalist, number one, didn't say unequivocally that it was a terrorist attack. And maybe an hour later, it was discovered that truly this was an accident, that this explosion was truly an accident, and then it was discovered. So there are some downsides to only releasing a portion of news at a time. Remember, there are advantages and disadvantages to everything. And I'll pause here to say that when it comes to, as you all know, when it comes to advantages and disadvantages, you have to do a risk management calculation. Which one of these advantages or disadvantages are going to serve our purposes better? And so this is why we're talking about both advantages and disadvantages, so that we can make intelligent decisions on which of these trends in journalism we want to begin to adopt in our own context, in our own community of faith. The third disadvantage of iterative journalism, it can lead to breaking the trust between news organizations and the public. Again, if information is getting out there that is not really vetted, that is not really ultimately true, then the public begins to a degree distrust that news source. So the news source has to make a very calculated decision. How fast do we want to put this news out there when we don't really know all the details at the moment? A very difficult calculation for a news source to make. We would do this at the Adventist Review all the time. What is the perfect time in which to release a story in which we're at least fully aware that this is factual versus when to hold the story, knowing that other news organizations were going to post ahead of us? Very difficult calculation to make. Now, a couple of quotes here regarding iterative journalism and the downside. This one from an author of a book, Ryan Holiday. The book is entitled "Trust Me, I'm Lying." Trust me, I'm lying. So Ryan Holiday writes, "The economics of the internet create a twisted set of incentives that make traffic more important and more profitable than the truth. This is a predictable pattern that can be exploited." This is what we talked about earlier. In other words, the traffic to a news website is critical because advertisers want to see that traffic. So the news organization wants to generate that traffic. News organizations are competing against other news organizations, and they want to be the ones to say, we have had the most traffic to our website, thus you can trust us, you can put your marketing dollars in with us. Very, very difficult set of circumstances that Mr. Holiday there is writing about. The second quote that I'll share with you is from Tracy Loxley. She is a writer who is reviewing the book, Trust Me, I'm Lying. And her own comments are very, very insightful. She says, the problem for journalists is that there really isn't very much that's newsworthy. But in order to drive clicks, spectacles need to be constantly invented. Wow, that is quite a mouthful there. Because we need to drive clicks, spectacles need to be constantly invented, right? Wow. Okay, so let's move on then to, because of the interest of time, let's move on to the next trend in journalism, and that is demand-based journalism. Demand-based journalism. So what do we mean by demand-based journalism? This is the practice of gathering and disseminating the type of news that a news outlet perceives its audience wants, right? So some of the advantages of demand-based journalism. Number one, the content is aligned more with the interests of the reader. So you think about it, that's not necessarily a bad thing for a news organization to say, we understand our audience and we know that our audience normally likes to hear about these types of topics or events that are happening in this part of the world. This is very true of any, let's say, local newspaper in a very small town. Clearly, what's important is what's going on around the world, but what's even more important, what's happening in our local city, right? Why are the roads so bad? What's happening to our schools? So demand-based journalism is something that clearly aligns content more with the interests of the reader, and ultimately it's not a bad thing in and of itself. Remember, we'll talk about some disadvantages too. A second advantage is that more people will engage with the material. Again, this is pure psychology. If you resonate more with the material that is being that is being given to you, you will essentially have more interest in it, and you will engage more with that particular material. So here is a quote that I'd like to share with you about demand journalism. And here is what this particular writer says. The shift thus has been, let me start again. The shift thus has to be about better and more distinct journalism in an incredibly competitive battle for attention about a greater focus on what readers actually value. So Rasmus Kleis Nielsen, the director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and professor of political communication at the University of Oxford, argues that journalism has to take into account this battle for attention, and has to understand that news has to be, to a degree, contextualized, as he says, about a greater focus on what readers actually value, right? Making the point that there are some advantages to demand-based journalism. Now, here are some disadvantages. Number one, demand-based journalism reinforces and further develops a news organization's bias. The more a news outlet limits its content to its target audience's needs, the more narrow its perspective. I'm going to pause here for just a moment and tell you that in the United States, the landscape of journalism is completely out of control. Now, these are only my thoughts and observations. Again, this would be a commentary from my point of view. It used to be back in the even back in the 70s and in 1980s and 1990s, that most news organizations sought a middle ground, that most news outlets in the United States sought to provide a truly fair and balanced perspective on any given topic or event. Over the last 10, 15, 20 years, it's almost as if news organizations have decided demand-based journalism is the only type of journalism we will do. Thus, even anchors, news anchors, will inject their own personal opinion into reporting the news, whether verbally, sometimes even non-verbally. Those of you who are communication professionals can understand what that means, what the eyes do, what the shoulders do, right? Either verbally or non-verbally will place commentary into the news stream rather than just being objective reporters. Remember, no news organization is objective, no human being is objective, but at least in the United States, they used to try. Now, you can clearly divide the field of news outlets into progressive and conservative, into liberal and conservative, into Republican and Democratic-based news outlets. It to a degree is very sad. However, the good news is at least you know what you're getting. And at least you can go into it with your eyes open, knowing that if I watch this particular news outlet or read this particular newspaper, there will always be a slant, either this way or that way. Now, I'm talking in generalities. There are pockets of hope of news organizations that seek very, very much to be as objective as possible. But that is not necessarily the case with the great majority of news outlets in society in general, at least the way we see it here in the United States. So again, these are some of the disadvantages of demand-based journalism. You begin to curate only what you know that your audience wants to hear or read. And the more you do that, the greater your audience grows, but it is only one type of audience with one very sort of narrow worldview. Number two, demand-based journalism leads to and is related to what's called advocacy journalism. And I already sort of referenced this. These are overtly biased news pieces that are aligned with specific ideology. And again, news anchors, news reporters clearly demonstrate their bias without trying to hide it, because they believe in what's called advocacy journalism. You're advocating for something that you consider to be a just cause, or something that is aligned with your political worldview, right? Number three, so that's acceptable when it relates to topics, but could be dangerous when ideologies are involved. When you begin to weave ideologies into this advocacy journalism, whose ideology is more truthful than the other, or more beneficial to society than someone else's ideology. And it leads to what we can call an ethical dilemma in news. And here it is. If we only feed readers and viewers what they actually value or what they actually want, are we being responsible purveyors of truth? Are we being responsible agents of truth in society? In other words, is society really benefiting by taking in only one point of view? At the same time, if the audience truly wants it, and this is why it's an ethical dilemma, some say, we might as well give them what they want in the most thoughtful and accurate way, with the most thoughtful and accurate perspective on it. I think I'd like to share with you what I would consider to be quite a balanced perspective on this matter, and it comes from this particular publisher. Elizabeth Bramson Bordeaux is a CEO and publisher of MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology Review. And she writes, in 2019, I think we'll see successful media companies get much more reflective about why their audiences read them or why they don't. What do these many varied and highly intimate interactions, clicks, say about the hopes, dreams, and fears of the human beings behind them? How can these insights drive deeper, stronger connections? So what she's saying is we should pay attention to what the reader or the viewer wants or values, but not necessarily just to turn around and feed them only that. What she's saying is that ought to drive conversations that have us struggling with how do we better understand the dreams and fears of human beings, and how do we create deeper content? How do we create stronger connections with people along their life journey in the content that we create? I believe it's a balanced approach to this sort of thing. Now, we move into the next trend in journalism, and that is called automated journalism. We'll stay on this slide here for just a moment.
Costin.
Yes, I heard a voice.
Yes, it's me, Corrado. Can we take just 3 minutes of break?
Yes, in fact, let me do this. There's a natural break when we move to the second portion, which is just in a couple of minutes. This is the last bit that I will talk about, this automated journalism. And then as you can see, our next slide, we move into the second part, which is journalism within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So if you'd permit me 2 more minutes, then we'll conclude this first part, and then we'll take a break.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Okay, so automated journalism, or what's called algorithmic or robot journalism, in fact, I can at this point stop sharing my screen, is the practice of using artificial intelligence to sort through data and existing new content and to gather information for a journalist or to actually write short news stories. So in essence, what we're saying is this is a partnership between AI and human intelligence to write particular stories. You may be surprised to learn that some of the largest news companies are already using AI. The Associated Press, the BBC, Reuters, the New York Times. And so ultimately what this looks like is that bots and artificial intelligence, they search for content all around, and they begin to either write short stories from scratch. So let's say 2 to 3 paragraph stories that can quickly be placed into the marketplace, or they provide all of that content and maybe even a first draft to a human journalist who then would write a longer story. So there's an enormous trend in journalism to use AI. Some of the trade-offs, advantages. Number one, journalists can focus on the deeper aspect of stories rather than on all of this kind of hunting and gathering for information. Journalists can track down breaking news stories. They can do faster research. They can do faster fact checking. And they can create narratives. These AI bots can create narratives from raw data. Clearly, there are some disadvantages. The disadvantages are, number one, artificial intelligence can miss critical context that is clear to a human being, but not very clear to a machine at this point in time. So context, very important that a machine could miss, and that could lead to fake news. Unintentionally in this case, because the AI interprets something and then creates something that is a fact that ultimately was not. Number three, it creates somewhat boring news stories. AIs at this point in time are not actually very creative. So it creates more of a sort of a boring style of writing that may or may not get a lot of engagement by readers. And that, I believe, would be the last disadvantage that ultimately we could point to. Many, many more concepts that we could explore in terms of trends in journalism, and also this last one that I just talked about, the artificial intelligence trend. But we'll leave it at that. And as promised, Corrado, this is the end of the first part. And then in the second part, we're going to talk about, well, how does all of this relate to journalism within the Seventh-day Adventist Church?
Costin, are you there? Okay, good. Costin, it's your time again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. And again, I very much want to remind you that, again, regarding the participatory environment that we have here, don't hesitate to share questions in the chat, and I will hopefully be able to offer at least some insight into it, and very much looking forward to your wisdom and insight into any of these topics as well as we engage together here in dialogue. So let's now move into the second part of this presentation. I'll once again bring up our slides to make sure that we have these. And here is where I'd like to share some observations and some advice from my years working not only as a communication professional, but most recently as the news editor of the Adventist Review and Adventist World magazines at the world headquarters of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So we'll go through some quick tips. We'll talk about some current challenges, and then we will conclude with 3 goals that we could all sort of gather around when it comes to the future of journalism within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So that's our roadmap for those of you that like roadmaps for the second part of our conversation. So let's begin with these quick tips. Number one, let's see, there it is. Write news stories, traditional news stories, in the AP or Associated Press style for the greatest adoption from global Adventist news platforms. So in essence, if you would like to write your story and have it be very quickly be disseminated by Adventist Review or Adventist News Networks, or even some of the other divisions around the world, or other news outlets that are interested in Seventh-day Adventist news and events, write it from the Associated Press style. Remember what I said at the beginning of our presentation. Many of the stories that we see around the world are written from the public relations angle. Very sort of, to a degree, exaggerated claims and emotions, and there isn't the distinction between the voice of the writer and then the voice of local leaders and experts. So again, begin to refresh your own understanding of what Associated Press style means, And
I commenti che possono fare gli intervenuti, ma il giornalista
world well because it is a generally accepted style of news reporting. Now, clearly, I understand that various countries and various communities, they have various norms that drive the type of news writing that is normative. We like to say normative in your country, but in general around the world, the type of news writing that is most quickly accepted is the standard Associated Press style of news. Second is always begin with an establishing paragraph. There are many, many different stories that are wonderful stories, but that begin this way. In a field with flowers that had just begun to bloom, there was a sense of excitement as all of a sudden I'm thinking to myself, I don't even know what the writer is writing about, much less do I have the time to discover it. So in traditional news writing, we always begin with what's called an establishing paragraph. The establishing paragraph always begins with what we talked about earlier, the what and the where and the who. Start there, even though it's not as creative as a journalist may like to approach the writing with, but that will once again receive the broadest adoption around the world. At Adventist Review, we would always try to rework the first part of a news story so that if the establishing paragraph was buried in, let's say, paragraph 3, we would put it up at the top so that the reader would clearly know what is the story about, and your story would actually end up being read by more people because we follow the traditional format of news writing. Now, remember we talked about various forms of journalism, and one of them is feature writing. In a feature news story, more often than not, you can begin with the field of flowers and the rain, and so all of that is appropriate within a given context. But I would argue that maybe 80% of our journalism needs to be the standard news writing journalism that is this Associated Press style, or formatted according to the Associated Press style. Next is always write for the external audience. There is literally, in this digitally connected world of ours, there is no such thing as an internal audience anymore. That is a fallacy. Even to say we are creating an internal release that will only go to, let's say, Seventh-day Adventist leaders. All it takes, and you know very well that this happens all the time, all it takes is one person to take that release and to make it publicly available, or to post it on social media because they disagree with whatever the organization is doing. So always choose your words as if you are writing to an external audience. Always. There's no exception to this rule. Always assume an external audience. What that also means is don't use internal language that is not easily understood by an external audience. And always think to yourself, imagine a good friend of yours who is not a Seventh-day Adventist, who is not even a practicing Christian. What if they were to read whatever you are writing or editing? How would they relate to this? Because the great possibility is that it will be shared in one way or another. Now, the next short, quick tip, and that is use shorter sentences and shorter paragraphs. We don't delve into it much in this study, but there have been social science studies that demonstrate that attention spans have fallen dramatically over the last 10 years, dramatically around the world. So we have shorter attention spans, which means that if we do want to practice a little bit of demand-based journalism, at least what we could do is we can begin to formulate sentences that are shorter and paragraphs that are shorter, just to resonate with a general sense of less attention span around the world. Plus, it's actually good practice because not everyone is at the same reading quality. And I think all of us know that as, not reading quality, reading level, I'm sorry. Not everyone is at the same reading level when it comes to your audience. Some individuals who might have a lot less education may struggle with sentences that are long and complex, or paragraphs that are just very dense and very, very long. So always keep that in mind. In terms of the length of the overall article, aim for 600 to 800 words. We found that is the magic formula for a solid news story that is comprehensive enough to be able to tell you everything you should know, should have quotes from different leaders and different participants and community members that talk about this particular topic without going too long. We also discovered by doing some exploration at the Adventist Review that anything over 1,000 words, the readership dramatically drops after 1,000 words. We try to stay under 1,000 words, but 600 to 800 words is just a really great sweet spot, we call it, for journalism. Now, remember, we're not talking about feature news writing, so on and so on. We're talking about, at this point, standard news writing. Next, aim to always include at least one excellent high-resolution picture to accompany the article. Now, I know this is difficult. Because many times an event happens or a story develops and no one thinks to assign a professional photographer. The reality is that many of our local events, we don't even have the ability to have a professional photographer there. However, remember, we do all have smartphones these days, and many of them, if you've bought either an iPhone or an Android or any other type of smartphone in the last couple of years, will have a very high quality camera associated with this. So at least begin to educate your fields that if there is something going on, a few people should at least try to capture a few images of that. So out of that can come one excellent high resolution picture that can accompany the story. Another thing, by the way, that we struggled with at Adventist Review is wonderful content, but we would have to use a stock photography, which is not excellent when you're talking about journalism. And so if we can change the culture around the world to produce greater images, at least one good one for every story, that would make an enormous difference. Now, some current challenges that we face within the Seventh-day Adventist Church when it comes to journalism. Again, I will practice what I said earlier was a trend in journalism, and that is transparency. I too hold transparency as a very core value. So I will be as transparent as I possibly can in the context of our conversation here regarding some of the current challenges that we struggle with. Number one, we within the Seventh-day Adventist Church do struggle to remember the difference between public relations and journalism when it comes to reporting news. I've already kind of intimated and referenced some specifics when it comes to that. More or not news stories that are generated by Seventh-day Adventist news outlets around the world. Again, remember, I'm talking in general, tend to be more of this kind of public relations writing that tend to be more triumphalistic in nature, that tend to not interview as many people as needed, so that it's the voice of the author or the writer that really comes through rather than the voice of experts and so on and so forth. So we do struggle with that. We also struggle, number two, with few breaking news stories, or should I say relatively few breaking news stories that are shared with the World Church family. Again, I can tell you that sometimes we would hear of something that happened, and it would be days later that a story would come out to validate what was happening in one part of the world. So I really would like us to engender a conversation about how to create a culture of very fast breaking news. Again, you remember our conversation about iterative journalism, with a commitment to making sure that what we do publish is as accurate as we possibly can get it, even if we're involved in fast breaking news. And then the third one, and then I'll pause because I see at least one hand up. The third challenge is we have even fewer appropriately transparent stories that are shared. So we'll go over some of these in greater detail as we go through some of the goals that we have set for us to consider. But I see Stefan's hand, and I'm wondering if you have a question at this point in time or a comment.
Yes, I do. I have a question in regard to the aim for a high resolution image. Most of the news that we provide or that we issue, that we communicate, is via the internet. And from the internet, it's duplicated to various sources. And automatically, even if I put in a high resolution photo, it's reduced in size. So sometimes some of the editors call back because they want for print a high resolution photo. But mainly the work that we do from our office is with the electronic media. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, that is actually a very, very good question, Stefan. I would respond that number one, we need to first and foremost generate high resolution images to begin with. So I'll give you a very specific example of what happened many, many, many different times. We would find the image associated with the news article. And this is the worst case scenario. We would need to publish that in writing. So in other words, we would need to publish it in the print Adventist Review or in the print Adventist World. And the printing press is very unforgiving when it comes to low resolution images. The digital space is actually more forgiving, but the print medium is very unforgiving. So now we would have to literally go back to the source of the news article to say, do you have access to the most high resolution version of this particular image? So ultimately what would happen is sometimes they would say, yes, we have it right here in our files and we'll send it to you via some kind of mechanism. But sometimes they would say, we don't. This is the highest resolution that we have. We'll contact the original photographer and see if they have a higher resolution. And sure enough, that photographer would ultimately have one that was high resolution enough, but somehow even the original posting did not include a high resolution photo. The second part of my answer is what I consider to be really great news. And that is, during my years at the General Conference, I worked with some key partners in developing a new approach to news gathering. And that will ultimately come to be sort of referenced as the Adventist News Exchange. It's a brand new platform. Some of you may have heard me talking about this at various gains. I would really suggest that you connect with Brent Harding at the General Conference specifically about this new platform. Adventist News Network is now using this platform, and it was developed in a very customized way with our programmers at Stimme der Hoffnung that would allow for, Stefan, this very concept to be now practiced and very tangible, where a high resolution photo is available in the Adventist News Exchange and now is available to anyone around the world who wants to republish that story, rather than, as you said, a photo that sort of degrades in quality as it gets shared and posted and copied and pasted off of news sites. So without taking too much more time, because I'm also aware that we need to finish on time, I would suggest that you continue that conversation with the Office of Communication at the General Conference, and more specifically with Brent Harding regarding their rollout of this platform around the world. I know that the initial intention was to roll it out first for the Adventist News Network, and then at some point in time, as they work through some of the initial stages of the platform, then to make it available around the world. But again, I would at this point in time not be the authoritative source on that. Brent Harding would be. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Stefan. Now, moving on, we've talked about some of our current challenges. Let's move on to three goals that we can set for ourselves as Seventh-day Adventist communication professionals and journalists around the world, and specifically for your region there in Europe. Goal number one is to generate faster official communication. Goal one is to generate faster official communication. So in essence, to create a system of getting news quickly from local fields. Again, I shared with you that expediency, speed, was always a challenge during my time at the Adventist Review and Adventist World. So what are some of the challenges to this type of speed? Some of these challenges to expediency? Well, number one, we do have what we could call risk aversion. That is part of any organization. And leaders always struggle with risk aversion, risk management. Do we want to put this information out there? And what it creates is a bit of what we say in English is a bottleneck, right? It creates a very, very narrow lane through which the process then slows down significantly. Then the other part that contributes to this slowness that I've seen is that many times communication directors, whose job it is to generate communication fast, many times they have no time for this because they have many different hats organizationally that they wear, not just within communication, but sometimes we have communication directors who are serving as the directors of other departments as well. So it becomes very difficult to have someone who is committed to making sure that information comes out very, very quickly. Now, I'll offer maybe some approaches to help with the bottlenecking or to help with the challenges. Number one, I would say make it easy. Talking about sensitive matters, sensitive breaking news matters when it relates to an area of the world or a local church or a conference or union or a division. Make it easy. Sometimes the best approach is, and I've tried this myself, and I know that's how I know it works, is to print out the finished draft and to find that leader in the office, if he or she is truly in the office, and to say, listen, here's a story, put it right in front of them and say, can you take 5 minutes and just look over this, see if you see any significant issues. We'd like to publish this by the end of today. Take a look, let me know what you, and sometimes it's good just to kind of stand awkwardly in their office while they do that so that you can actually begin to have that approval process moving faster. Many other ways I'm sure that all of us can figure out to improve that time functionality of news writing, but that's just one way. The second thing that I'd like to offer in terms of approach to easing this challenge is to remind leaders, to remind administrators that they only have one chance to be the first to use their official voice. After that, anything that they will do will seem reactive. This is potentially one of the most important things that I can share with all of you in the context of this seminar. And that is that our Seventh-day Adventist Church struggles with being the first to lead with news because, again, there's a lot of conversation happening behind the scenes, a lot of risk aversion. Meanwhile, someone else puts the story together and brings it to the market, right? Brings it to the attention of Seventh-day Adventist readers or viewers around the world. At that point in time, now the organization has moved into a reactive phase rather than a proactive phase in which they actually get to set the narrative of their own story, and they can begin to craft the story in ways that are balanced and fair. Again, all of the elements that we talked about ahead of time. Remind leaders and administrators, you only have one chance to be the first to provide the news. Once someone else provides the news that isn't your organization, now you're seen as having to react to it, which is not a good position to be in as an organization, not a good position. And number three, consider your priorities if you are indeed a communication professional. If you are a communication director in particular and are wearing multiple hats, Sabbath school and other, keep in mind that crisis management, especially the distribution of news, important news about what's happening within an organization, there is hardly anything more important for the health of an organization than to be able to, in the 21st century, to communicate quickly and to communicate accurately to your various audiences, to your various constituencies, to your various communities. So that's goal number one, generate faster official communication. Goal number two that we are then going to focus on is having a clear protocol for crisis and sensitive news. So let's talk a little bit about crisis news. Number one, I would say, let your division and general conference know when something significant happens, either positively or negatively. Many things happen that are significant but are never shared or are shared rather slowly from the more local fields all the way up through the division and then the general conference. The reason that this is important is because we truly are a global family, and the internet and the digital space has made it, as you know, a much smaller world, has made it a much smaller community. And so what happens is people hear in one part of the world about something that's happening in another part of the world, but at that point in time, it's just rumor, or should I say it's just hearsay information. It would be better if the local fields quickly shared information to their division and again to the general conference as well, the news outlets there, so that they can share this accurate news information with many, many people around the world. Number two, remember that a crisis doesn't have to be negative. I referenced this a little bit earlier. Only something significant that impacts the reputation of the organization. Remember, a crisis is not always negative. It can be positive as well. Number three, as a communication professional, always advise your organization to say something. Always advise your organization to say something rather than nothing. This is extremely, extremely important, because if a reporter asks you a question, hey, what's going on? For you to say, or for the organization to say no comment, or for the organization not to return a phone call or an email, is truly perceived to be equated with guilt, or to be equated with trying to hide something, or equated with we're not quite ready, which means that something is going on behind the scenes that we really need to know about. So always say something, even if it's just a little bit of an introduction to the topic, to say, here's what we know. We don't know a lot of what we need to know, so we're studying that, we are exploring that, and when we have more information, we will get back to you. This is not just with secular news reporters engaging with the church, but it's also the church engaging with the church. So for instance, if someone from Adventist Review calls a division or even a local union or conference to say, hey, we've heard about this, what can you tell us about this? Engage actively. And yes, if it's a sensitive topic and you're a local conference, quickly pull in your division leadership and say, hey, Adventist Review, Adventist News Network is asking us about what they are hearing is happening. Help us understand how we can appropriately respond and what we can say at this point in time, so that we can engage in dialogue. And so it's not perceived that you're trying to either hide something or that there's some level of guilt involved that you're trying to hide by not engaging. Very, very, very serious dynamics that, again, within the Adventist Church, we need to practice more. Let's just put it that way. We need to put this a lot more into practice around the world. Here is the fourth and final note that I'll have on this kind of crisis news, and that is, it doesn't fully matter if we're not ready. This is back to our concept of iterative journalism. The reality is that others will indeed tell our story, and there's no guarantee that they're going to get it right without your voice, right? This is truly an advantage to iterative journalism if you do it well and if you do it right and if you have a commitment to quality. Get the news story out quickly using your own voice, and so then you can shape the narrative, and so that you can be appropriately transparent first, rather than again having to react. And again, many times our organizations will say, we're not ready, we don't have all the pieces to this. And meanwhile, many other news sources are already starting to generate information about what's happening, and they'll beat you to the market when it comes to shared. Oops, give me just one moment. Something fell on my table, and I'll put it back up in just a moment. Okay, I think we're good. So that is essentially the goal number 2, to have a clear protocol for crisis and sensitive news. Now, some notes on sensitive news, which are actually quite important for us to remember. There are some regions of the world that are truly sensitive in nature. And now I'm talking specifically within the context of Seventh-day Adventist mission. And some work, and the work of some Adventist organizations that are sensitive in nature. So you'll want to make sure that you stay very respectful, that we all stay very respectful of those sensitive regions of the world. And even though it's a fantastic story, it's always good to check with the communication professional and the communication director of that particular region to say, would it be okay with you if we republish this? Or would it be okay with you if we explore this topic a little bit more? Because ultimately, when it comes to mission and Adventist mission, there are truly some regions of the world in which people's lives do depend on whether a story is perceived positively or negatively. Some of the lives of our Adventist missionaries could be at stake if we're not careful. So again, we tried to walk that line very, very carefully at the Adventist Review and Adventist World. And sometimes we had to make the tough decision to not publish something because we realized it was a very, very sensitive topic that could actually have very serious ramifications and implications. So then goal number 3, this takes us to our last goal, and we're getting close to the conclusion of our seminar here. And that is, the goal number 3 is to increase the level of transparency in news writing. This potentially is the most significant of our goals. And that is, we have to remember, number 1, the differences in functions between public relations and journalism, very key to understanding how we move forward in this. Public relations, as you recall, tends to focus on the positive, tends to use triumphalistic language. And please keep in mind, there is a place for public relations in every organization. In fact, public relations needs to be part of every organization, but it needs to live in the area where public relations needs to live, not where journalism ought to be. So again, we have to be very careful in the way these two are defined and how they work together. News, as you recall, shares the facts. It shares them tactfully, respectfully, and appropriately, even if they don't make the organization necessarily look good, right? That's the commitment to journalism. And our goal should be that within Seventh-day Adventist sponsored journalism, that we should be able to speak about events or topics that don't necessarily make us look great, but we ought to be able to do that with our own voice, being appropriately transparent. And by the way, what do I mean by appropriate transparency? I referenced this earlier in the first part of the seminar, and that is, truly there are some elements within any organization that need to remain confidential for one reason or the other. When you talk about human resources and personnel matters, things that are even protected by law, there are elements that can't just be shared publicly with everyone. My argument or my suggestion would be that should be 2% of reality, and that 98% of reality should be organizations being courageous enough to share elements of their own journey that might not be positive, but that they demonstrate what we in healthcare call cycles of learning, right? Where an organization admits to the fact that they are in a learning process and they have learned from this moment, and this is how they're going to make things better. That definitely lends to more credibility within the marketplace, within a set of audiences and readers, rather than just not saying anything while all of the other news outlets surrounding the organization are already reporting on that particular topic. So I want to give you an excellent example, by the way, of how one particular division handled this very well within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I remember the story that we ran from the East Central Africa Division when that particular division reached a milestone 4 million members. So they were at that time the largest division. They still could be, but I've been out of touch with those numbers for about a year or so. But when they hit the 4 million member mark, they wrote their own story about this milestone. And here's the interesting thing. The article could have simply focused on the fact that In the East Central Africa Division, they've done so wonderfully when it comes to evangelism, and the individuals who are baptized are celebrated, which is very appropriate for an article on celebrating 4 million members. But it was a wonderful, wonderful surprise that the East Central Africa Division, of its own accord, without being asked to do so, ended the article with an acknowledgement that many of the people who are baptized in their division also tend to leave the church. And they talked about the number of people, the percentages, I think, that ultimately left the community of faith, the Seventh-day Adventist community of faith. And they reacted to it by saying, clearly we are not okay with this. And even as we celebrate this 4 million mark, we have already put into place a number of strategies for member retention. We understand that this is something that we need to struggle with. We have been struggling with it. The very balanced article on what could otherwise have been a public relations piece about the 4 million member mark. I was very, very impressed with the leaders there in the East Central Africa Division and with the communication professionals who made that story possible. So, in the context of this goal number 3, regarding increasing the level of transparency in news writing, make a case to leaders, make a case to administrators that if you don't tell your own story, someone else will, always. That really bears repeating. If you don't tell your own story, someone else will, always. And again, goal number 3, transparency. Remember that for 2 billion millennials, transparency is among the highest rated values when it comes to organizations. So that takes us through our 3 goals. Now, in the next less than a minute, we're going to go over what I would call a summary of what we need more of in Adventist journalism. So this is a rapid fire. I'm not actually going to stop to explain any of these. It's just a rapid fire summary of what we need more when it comes to Adventist journalism. Number 1, more coverage of important events and milestones at all levels of the church. Second, more solid and objective journalism, less public relations writing. Next one, more investigative journalism, addressing the why, not just the what. Next, more types of journalism, news commentaries on current issues, for instance. Next, the need for solid public relations, not spin, and solid journalism working together, separate functions that work together to keep a healthy distance from each other. Next, more transparency. Again, the term appropriate transparency. There are indeed matters that are private and confidential, but we need more transparency. Next, more writing for external audiences, fewer Adventist words and acronyms, more social media optimized content. And we're not just talking about long stories that are posted on social media with a hyperlink. More photojournalism, not only great pictures for articles, but great pictures that are the actual article. Next, more video journalism, video segments woven into articles and made available with subtitles for global distribution. And finally, more collaboration amongst Adventist organizations around the world to create and disseminate great news. On that note, everyone, thank you so much for your time and for your attention and for allowing me to share some of these principles that will hopefully help all of us communicate increasingly better around the world.
Thank you, Costin. It was amazing how in just 2 hours we told so much, and we advised you so much also in everything that you said. I would like to highlight 1 or 2 questions here, and not questions, but comments. At the same time, I invite people to put their questions if they want in the chat, 1 or 2 questions. We still have 10 minutes. Or maybe when the time comes, people can ask directly to Costin. But it was amazing because you highlighted some points over here that I think it's our common worries, especially when you talked about the question of one can be a producer and a user at the same time of information nowadays. When you refer to the democratized journalism, that new word that is a producer that each one of us is right now. There are a lot of challenges that they put in organizations such as the Adventist Church, because it turns very difficult to have an official position. And my question to you directly, I took note here of some words, the context in which we write. It's very important to have the goals that you put so rightful right now in mind. The word trust and transparency, you repeat it a lot, and it's very important that we always notice, because we are right now in the time of transparency, and the word trust is quite important. Also responsibility, you shared with us your worries about preparing and knowing how to act, especially in difficult situations. So these three words, context, trust, and responsibility, are very important, and I would like to highlight them. But what I would like to ask you directly is how difficult it is nowadays to make people understand the difference between an official statement and official position of the church. Because if anyone is a producer and the pastor may speak, and we know we can't not realize if he's speaking as a pastor, a person, someone that knows something that we don't know officially. Is he allowed to speak in the name of the church? How can we, as a church, differentiate the way people talk? Because if each one of us and the different instances inside the church are producers and not only users of information, we cannot control or want to control that effect. So we must be aware of how to control the official statement, the official position of our church, and especially of the organization we represent inside the church. Could you please help us do it?
Sure. Thank you, Paulo. Very, very excellent and important question. So clearly, any organization should have an agreed upon spokesperson, and many times a set of spokespeople who have specific subject area expertise. So let's break this down, with your permission, Paulo, to a local conference. So let's just say we have a local conference, and you have the pastor who you reference is a pastor within that conference. The conference itself should already have established a spokesperson or a set of spokespeople for any given event that happens to provide that official statement. The official statement of the church is truly very important in any given moment. A pause that I will put there to say, back to everything that we have talked about, explored together over the last couple of hours, many times the official statements that come out of our organizations are very limited, and many times don't include as much information as is available from people that are very much aware of what's going on. So the organization will say, I'll throw some percentages at it. The organization will only communicate 30% of what's happening. And everyone else is talking about the rest of the 60%, including the pastor. So the pastor now will try to offer some information, or should I say offer maybe a perspective that the official statement should have covered already, right? Many times we get into the situation in which the official statement is very short, is very limited, and this is all we're going to say. Again, sometimes for good reason. Sometimes an organization can't say more than it does. So clearly it's important to have a thorough public statement. It's important to have the official spokespeople who, again, everyone in that conference knows these are the official spokespeople that you'll see talking about a particular subject. But then on top of that, we do have to recognize, and this is where it becomes difficult, and the answer is not black and white. We do have to recognize that we live in a democratized journalistic environment. And what that means is that, the pastor is now a producer or a journalist, and will seek to provide, and here's the critical term, commentary on this particular topic. And here's where the church has to make a decision. Do we want to move into an era in which we stifle or we censor commentary that's coming from This pastor is a pastor, let's say, in good standing. You know what that means. A pastor who isn't a troublemaker, a pastor who is a functioning pastor within the organization. Do we want to have an environment in which we stifle that? Or do we want to move into an era in which we say, here is the official position of the church. You may hear other commentaries and reviews and opinions from members and leaders around the church, because that is the nature of a global church. Even that's the nature of a diverse community. So it's a very difficult, number one, question to answer, but it's even more of a difficult scenario to actually make happen tangibly, because we deal with that at the level of the global church. So some of you may be familiar with the fact that there are various differing opinions on almost anything that the Seventh-day Adventist Church stands for around the world. So the question that the global church should answer is, do we want to stifle those perspectives or opinions, or do we want to say, look, here is the official statement of the global church, but clearly there are others who have various opinions, and that to a degree is okay, because we believe in the freedom of conscience. We believe in the ability of an intelligent human being to provide commentary, but that's not news. They are not a journalist. They are a human being expressing a commentary or opinion or creating a review about something that is very well crafted as an official journalistic piece or a release, right? Which is, again, that's not necessarily news. That's more, that comes more from the public relations side. Are there any follow-up questions to that? I'm sorry that it was a long answer, but you asked a question that is very challenging.
It was necessary, of course. I see here in the chat that Stefan Love is saying, is thanking for the presentation. Very impressive overview. I see here. There's some people are also thanking for the translation. Very important, that issue. Giuseppe Cupertino, thank you for the translation. I don't know if there is another question that somebody wants to ask right now. It's our final moment to do that. I see someone that, okay, Gael Cosendai, please.
Yes, I had a question about privacy, because you said that it's important to have pictures of events, and it definitely gives a story more exposure and attractiveness. But the experience as a pastor is when I want to make pictures of people in some events, they're not very comfortable at ending up on internet on something they don't control. They may be okay to put their pictures on Facebook because they feel like they have some kind of control, but it may be difficult to actually get pictures from events and deal with the privacy. We had to also deal with, for example, streaming worship services with children, for special worship services for children, and so on. So as soon as it goes to internet, it's worldwide, and to be able to gather some pictures and graphic material to put on the internet is maybe tricky sometimes.
Thank you, Gael. Again, very insightful question that we've dealt with in many different environments. Number one, I would say that these types of situations should be guided more than not by local laws, sort of country-specific laws that shape the conversation around privacy. So clearly, so for instance, let's talk about the European context in GDPR. You know, if there are some stipulations within GDPR that say, you know, privacy in terms of photos, these are the stipulations, we must abide by those laws and stipulations. However, there are also ways within those laws to understand what is acceptable within any context or not. So I'll tell you, here in the United States, there is a series of a series of laws that talk about public spaces that are sort of acceptable for public photography versus something that only focuses on, let's say, one person or a smaller group of people. So for instance, this last weekend, our family was in Chicago, Illinois, visiting, and we were downtown with a lot of different people touring. If there was a photographer in downtown Chicago taking pictures, and I happened to be in one of them, and they post that picture on the internet, within the laws of the United States, they have the full right to post that on the internet because it is a public space, and I have made myself publicly available within that public space. Now, if that photographer would have, and this is where the area gets great, if that photographer would have focused only on myself and my family and taken just a picture of the four of us and then posted that on social media, that gets a little bit more gray because now you are the center of attention. So number one, understand the laws of your country, maybe of your specific region. And number two, understand how you can better inform. Let's just talk about a local church, for instance. A local church can include in their bulletin a note that says, you know, part of worshiping here is that, number one, we have a media ministry, which means that you might get caught on camera, and by being here, you fully agree to that. It also means that we might take pictures of our events and we might post those pictures on our website or share them on a news story. So as long as you disclose that, and again, all of this has everything to do with your local set of laws. But as long as you disclose part of that, that helps to inform, again, your community as to whether they may or may not end up appearing in a news story. And I would say, finally, if you are going to take images of one person in particular, and obviously you've already mentioned photography of minors, that's a whole separate category of its own. But if you're going to take pictures of one person, it actually would be best practice and sometimes even legally required for you to have a quick sign-off sheet, a media release form that says, hey, I've just taken your picture, turned out really well. Do you mind if I share this, sign it? This is how we're going to use it. And if they refuse to sign it, then clearly you're not allowed to use that picture. So again, it all comes down to the laws of that particular region or country. Be aware of them, but also learn how to be more progressive when it comes to that, so that if you allow for disclosures, you can actually take better photographs.
Thank you, Costin. We are not going to take advantage of your patience anymore. It's 2 hours and almost 10 minutes more. I would like to thank all of you for being here, especially people that came from Germany, from Italy. So many people from Italy. Thank you very much. Also from people from Romania, the 3 countries that send the more representatives, and all the people in Europe. And I see some people from the General Conference also, but especially I'd like to thank right now to Costin Jordache for being present. I will give the final word to Corrado, but I would like to thank you personally. This is my first presence as the new EUD communication director here in the EUD, and it has been a pleasure to hear from you. I would also like to thank Andreas and Mercedes for their assistance to this meeting. But most of all, I would like to thank Corrado for the idea and for taking care of this meeting. My dear friend Corrado, it was very, very nice to have this idea. It was a pleasure to be present and especially to work with you today. So the final word is for you, Corrado.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you very much. Thank you, Costin. I already attended your workshops in Gain Europe, and I was really so touched by your words. I say we have to share this content with the others, and so you were a little bit more deeper this time. And if we call you the third time, maybe you go down more deeper. So maybe Paolo, why not in the future to organize another meeting like this, another training like this? But in any case, thank you very much, Paolo. Thank you very much to take time to continue what I organized for this Congress, for this training. Thank you very much. And yes, let's finish with a prayer. Is okay? Let's pray. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Father, for the time that you gave us during these 2 hours to share together how to best represent you, the story of the church, what is happening in our context, and to do this at a very professional level. Thank you for the suggestion and the training and the support and the recommendation of Costin. What he said is a treasure for us. Thank you again, Father, because you gave to Costin this possibility to share his knowledge regarding communication, regarding journalism. And now bless our church to receive from us as a journalist the best news, the best stories, in order to highlight who we are, why we are here, and why we are waiting for you. Thank you again, and bless also Paolo to continue this ministry in our division as a communication director. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Amen. I would like to ask how we can get hold of the recording, by request or automatically?
Request. Everyone that would like to receive a record, I will send, because otherwise to send and maybe is not correct. So he who would like to receive the record, I will send. What about your PowerPoint, Costin? We don't need, or maybe can you share your PowerPoint too?
Yes, I can share the PowerPoint, and then what I don't have, but I will try to work on is a kind of a presentation version of my notes that could be helpful as well. So I'll do some work on that as well.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So send a request and you will receive. Jesus said, ask and you will receive an answer.
That's good. Very good.
Thank you very much, you all. It was nice to see you, especially
you.
to you,
Bye.
Costin. Thank you for your knowledge.
Thank you, Giuseppe, for the translation again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.